By the time of this video going out, more than 17,000 pieces of military equipment have been lost in the war between Russia and Ukraine. If we look through each case of equipment being lost and put them into a chronological chart, we could gain some insight into the conflict. Luckily, I have already done that, and in this video I will show the results. Although this data only shows part of the total losses, it is still able to give some insight into the conflict. Without further ado, let's begin. At the start of the war, the balance of power greatly favored Russia. This gave Russia such a strong advantage over Ukraine that it was able to launch an offensive into Ukraine from many directions. When the invasion was launched, the casualties quickly climbed to high numbers. During the first week of the war, Russia lost 450 pieces of military equipment, while Ukraine lost around 350 pieces. At that time, the Russian forces made inroads into Ukraine from several directions. But the losses being similar in size, the balance of forces still strongly favored Russia, and Russia continued with the invasion. But during the next weeks, the ratio changed, and for the next 4 weeks, the Ukrainian losses dropped to around 100, while the Russian losses remained the same. What might have caused the large drop in the Ukrainian losses? I don't know why it happened, but a possible explanation is that it was caused by Ukrainian forces taking defensive positions in the country's cities. You see, at that time, the fighting reached major Ukrainian cities. The Russian forces attempted to storm Ukrainian-controlled Mykolaiv and Mariupol in the south of the country. Further north, they attempted to unsuccessfully encircle and capture the cities of Kharkiv, Sumy and Chernihiv. They also tried to assault Kyiv, with heavy fighting taking place in the suburbs and in the terrain around the city. During that time, Russia was unable to secure many territorial gains. Fighting in and around these cities could have been favorable to the defenders, and this can be a possible explanation for the reduction in the Ukrainian casualties. The high Russian losses began to add up. The lower Ukrainian casualties and higher Russian losses, which were inflicted during this time, meant that by the start of April, Russia had lost 2,000 more pieces of military equipment than Ukraine. This lowered Russia's strength. At the same time, Ukraine mobilized its army, and this greatly increased its strength. These two developments caused Russia's advantage over Ukraine to greatly decrease. Phase 1 of the war was over, and Phase 2 began. For the next 2 months, the number of casualties dropped significantly, with Ukrainian weekly casualties going down from 110 to 70, and the Russian losses dropping from 450 to 170. By that time, the large advantage that Russia had over Ukraine at the beginning of the war had greatly decreased. This meant that Russia could put much less pressure on Ukraine than it had before, which meant Russia had to scale down its attacks. It abandoned the offensive in North Ukraine and withdrew its forces from this part of the country. It now launched an offensive on a part of the front line in southern Ukraine. The decrease in the scale of the offensive caused the drop in Russian losses, but the Ukrainian casualties did not decrease by the same proportion. This was the result of a change in the loss ratio. If in the previous 4 weeks Ukraine lost 1 piece of equipment for 4.5 pieces of Russian equipment, then now this number had dropped to 1 for every 2.4. The increased Ukrainian losses might have been caused by Ukrainian forces fighting harder to hold on to territory, and this might have resulted in Russian territorial gains being small. During this time, Russia was only able to gain a limited amount of ground. Ukraine used this time to train and expand its army. Russia's advantage over Ukraine decreased even more, and it had to scale down the offensive. During the next 3 months, the losses dropped even further. The casualties were halved, with Russian losses dropping from the weekly losses of 170 to 85, while Ukrainian losses dropped from 70 to 35. Russia continued its offensive. Because its advantage had decreased, it had to attack on a smaller part of the front line. This resulted in Russia gaining a smaller amount of territory, its main achievement being the capture of the cities of Lysychansk and Severodonetsk. After that, the war entered a new phase. At the start of the war, the loss numbers began high. with both sides suffering 800 combined losses in the first week. But 5 months into the war, the combined casualties had dropped to 120. This shows that as the war went on, the relative advantage that Russia possessed decreased more and more. By August, the balance of power had become near equal. Ukraine was now also strong enough to launch its own offensive. In August, Ukrainian forces attacked Russia in the western part of the front, hoping to exploit the vulnerable Russian supply lines over the Dnipro River. The offensive took place on a small part of the front, but it was not successful, and by the end of August could take only very little territory. But then for the second week of September, the casualties reached 40 Ukrainian losses versus 500 Russian losses. At that time, the balance of power was near equal or slightly favoring Ukraine. So why were the Russian losses so high while the Ukrainian casualties were so low? Ukraine was able to outsmart the Russian side and launched a surprise attack in the Kharkiv region. The Ukrainian forces broke through the Russian front behind their forces fighting in the Donbas and threatened to cut their communications. This made the Russians retreat to avoid encirclement. A possible explanation for these numbers of casualties is that there was actually little fighting during this operation. For the Ukrainian losses, this explanation seems logical, because as there was little fighting, few Ukrainian forces were lost. But it also does explain the large number of Russian losses. You see, 2/3 of the 500 Russian casualties were not destroyed in combat, but abandoned by the Russians during the retreat, which suggests that the Russians were caught so by surprise that they did not have the time to retreat all of their forces, let alone put up strong resistance. Nevertheless, more than 150 pieces of their equipment were damaged or destroyed during the time this operation took place. This operation was very successful for Ukraine, and in just 1 week it captured all the land up to the Oskil River. In the next weeks, the combat continued as Ukraine attempted to press its advantage. During the next 14 weeks, the Russian casualties dropped from the weekly losses of 150 to 60 pieces of military equipment. At the same time, the Ukrainian weekly losses first climbed to 70 and then dropped to 20. A possible explanation is that Russia took large-scale measures to turn the balance of power to its favor by sending reinforcements into Ukraine, and these measures began to decrease Ukrainian advantage. Ukraine stopped attacking after running into increased casualties. During this time, Ukraine took over some territory in the east, and Russian forces also abandoned their bridgehead over the Dnipro River, and Ukraine regained control over the city of Kherson. By that time, a new balance of power had been achieved, with Russia gaining a slight advantage and introducing the next stage of the conflict. During the next 7 weeks, the casualties began to grow again. At the end of this time period, they reached 30 Ukrainian weekly casualties versus 100 Russian casualties. They remained at that rate for the next 8 weeks. This period coincides with the Russian winter offensive. The balance of power was near equal, with Russia having a slight advantage. Because of the advantage being small, Russia could not put up a lot of pressure and had to attack on small sections of the front. This resulted in a small amount of territory being captured and a small number of military equipment being lost. The main success was the capture of the town of Bakhmut. By that time, Ukraine had gained a small advantage over Russia. The casualties dropped off after the Russian winter offensive. During the next 10 weeks, the loss numbers gradually increased to 60 Ukrainian losses versus 120 Russian losses. After that, this rate remained roughly the same for the next 10 weeks. This period coincides with the Ukrainian summer offensive. The Ukrainian advantage was small, which meant that it could not put much pressure on Russia. For this reason, it attacked on small sections of the front. The offensive lasted into the autumn and saw a limited amount of territory captured. By mid-September, it seems that Ukraine had lost its advantage and the balance of power had once again become equal. Because Ukraine scaled down its offensive, the losses dropping to 35 Ukrainian casualties to 80 Russian weekly losses. Sometime later, Russia switched to an offensive, which led to the weekly Russian losses to surge to 150 pieces of equipment, while the Ukrainian losses remained the same. As the cold and rainy weather of the autumn sets in, this is how the situation is at the time of making this video. Too long didn't watch? At first Russia attacked and lost a large amount of military equipment. This caused it to scale down its offensive during the following weeks. Then Ukraine launched a counter-offensive which Russia did not expect and suffered a lot of casualties. After that, the balance of power had been near equal and neither side was able to launch large-scale attacks. This is all for this video. If you found it interesting, then put a like on it and see if you enjoy some more content from this channel.